Then cometh Simon Peter, and went into the sepulchre, and seeth the linen clothes lie, and the napkin that was about his head, not lying with the linen clothes, but wrapped together in a place by itself. Supposedly, genetic researchers are making progress so quickly that it will soon be possible to clone complex biological organisms from a single blood cell. But if that day comes, will we be able to refrain from the irresistible urge to play sorcerer? What if someone wanted to create another Adolf Hitler or a new Nero? Why not another Jesus? To perform this miracle, we would need to start with a sample of the blood of Christ. According to some, this sample is already available in Spain. Traveling north along the highways of Spain, you can't help but notice the country's distinctive character, a combination of Roman and Arab influences, a tribute to its heritage. Spanish architecture and decor are derived from different styles, blended so well together that it is difficult to tell them apart. Conquered by the Arabs in 711, Spain remained a Muslim country for 3 centuries. The Christian Visigoths who had occupied the country prior to that fled to the north as Islam took over the country. But where did the Visigoths come from?
Alors d'abord les Visigoths,
well, the Visigoths began as Western Goths. The Goths were tribes of the Germanic Empire who left Scandinavia and settled on the shores of the Danube, far to the east, which put them in contact with the Roman civilization for several decades, perhaps even centuries. For instance, the Goths, the Visigoths, were converted to Christianity. So, after having lived on the periphery for so long, serving Rome from outside of its borders, preventing other Germanic tribes from attacking Rome, the Visigoths made their way inside the empire. They shared the Western Empire. The Ostrogoths settled in Italy, and the Visigoths settled in the Iberian Peninsula, in what was then known as Hispania, now known as Spain.
Then from the Asturias in the north, the Christian Visigoths took back control of Spain. It did not become a Christian country until 1492, the year that Christopher Columbus set sail in search of a new world. Further to the north, the roads of Spain lead me to areas that remained Christian as the Roman Empire declined, where people resisted the Muslims. The path is paved with churches and abbeys all the way to Oviedo. The city of Oviedo is in northern Spain in the Principality of Asturias. Founded in the 8th century on a hill that was referred to as Ovetum, the capital city now has a population of around 220,000. Overlooking a large square in the center of the city stands the Cathedral of San Salvador. Built soon after the Muslims took over the country, Oviedo's cathedral has been given the name Sancta Ovetensis, a title which refers to the quality and quantity of relics it contains, including a small enigmatic veil known as the Sudarium. The cathedral has undergone many changes since it was first built in 757. The cathedral that tourists admire today has a Gothic flair to it. Due to a lack of funding while it was being built, the cathedral only has one tower. However, this single tower is the most important one in Europe. Like the thousands of tourists who have visited the cathedral before me, as I stepped inside, I found myself in awe of the incredible architecture and decor, and I was particularly drawn to the presentation of so many relics carefully preserved in cases full of history. If you go down to the basement, in the Camera Santa, the Holy Chamber, you will find the goal of my visit, the mysterious cloth known as the Sudarium of Oviedo.
Le Sudarium d'Oviedo.
The Sudarium of Oviedo is a linen cloth measuring 84 centimeters by 53 centimeters, which is being preserved in the city of Oviedo, a small city in northern Spain, not far from Santiago de Compostela.
Loin de Saint-Jacques de Compostelle.
The Sudarium of Oviedo is the napkin that was found in the sepulchre, wrapped together in a place by itself, to quote the description given in the Gospels. It is covered with several blood stains and brings to mind another fascinating and mysterious relic, the Shroud of Turin. The original relic is carefully preserved in a sacred case, far from the eyes of curious onlookers. However, a copy of the napkin is on display for Christians to view.
There's often confusion between the Sudarium and the Shroud. The Shroud of Turin is a large linen cloth used as a burial cloth. The Sudarium is mentioned in the Gospel of John. The shroud was discovered at one place in the tomb, and the Sudarium was seen folded off by itself. It may have been rolled, depending on the translation. The Sudarium was basically a cloth used to wipe sweat off their brow when the weather was very hot. Pausing in their prayers to wipe their brow was demanded by the temple. When someone died a violent death, his face had to be covered by a Sudarium. So Jesus was on the cross, and when a request was made to take him down from the cross, the soldiers came and saw that he was dead, and that's when they pierced his ribs. That was a gesture of compassion. Like when people are shot to death, there's always a shot to the head, making it official. So when Jesus was pierced in the ribs with the lance, a Sudarium was placed on his head. And of course, it stayed on Jesus' head as he was taken off the cross and carried to the tomb. So it was mandatory. In the meantime, Joseph of Arimathea went to purchase a shroud. Then he came back and they buried Jesus' body. They placed the body in the tomb very quickly because Sabbath was approaching.
Due to its archaic weaving, the Sudarium of Oviedo is similar to other cloths that date back to ancient times. Its history is a combination of tradition and fact. After Christ's resurrection, the Sudarium was kept by his disciples in a cedar chest.
According to some historians, it can even be traced back before the year 614, when it was still in Palestine.
Actually, there are no exact traces of its presence in Jerusalem, since it seems that there were many different pieces of burial linens. There wasn't just the shroud, there were also strips of linen used to wrap the shroud around the body. There were most likely other cloths used as well to prepare the body, since the women came back on Easter Sunday to complete the work, which included cleaning the body, cutting the hair, shaving the beard. There were 7 ritual ablutions in all, and then changing the shroud, replacing it with a clean one. There were many sheets of linen involved, and the Sudarium was one of them, and it was kept by the disciples. As early as the 4th century, there are accounts by a bishop named Archaeology who said, "Here is the burial clothing in a chest," and he provided a certain amount of detail. So we know that the clothing was there, in a chest.
The relic was kept in Jerusalem until 614, when the city fell to the Persians.
The Persians had already taken Edessa and now were attacking Jerusalem. What was the reaction? They wanted to ensure that the relics were in a safe place. No doubt the relics had been dispersed to different locations. That's what they did back then, so that if one relic fell into the hands of the enemy, all was not lost. Some of the relics were sent to Alexandria in Egypt, including the Sudarium.
The story goes that a monk named Philip escaped from Jerusalem, taking the chest with him to Alexandria in Egypt.
Then the Persians arrived in Egypt around the year 630 or 640, and that's when the Sudarium was on the move again. It traveled through all of North Africa, well, that's how the legend goes, and arrived in Cartagena, Spain.
In Cartagena, the chest was received by Saint Fulgentius, Bishop of Écija.
From then on, we have a few historic facts to grasp onto. It arrived in Cartagena around 640 and was received by Bishop Saint Fulgentius, so it was kept in southern Spain.
Shortly before 718, a new oak chest was built to replace the original, which had become fragile. This new case was probably made so that the Sudarium could be carried to northern Spain. At the time, the Visigoths were under threat of an Arab invasion from south of the Iberian Peninsula, so they headed to the northern parts of the country, taking their precious relics with them.
Around that time, the Muslims invaded North Africa, then they invaded southern Spain. The Sudarium was evacuated because of the threat from Muslims and Saracens. It was taken to northern Spain to the village of Oviedo in the Asturias in the year 812.
King Alphonse II had a special room built in the cathedral. It became known as the Camera Santa, the Holy Chamber. That was when Oviedo became an important stop for pilgrims heading for the holy city of Santiago de Compostela.
It was recognized as the Sudarium of Jesus Christ. A chapel was built, then a basilica was built, and then there was the pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela, and Oviedo was on the way. So pilgrims immediately began flocking to see the Sudarium.
On March 14, 1075, King Alphonse VI opened the reliquary and drew up an inventory of its contents. This document still exists today and officially confirms the presence of the Sudarium in Oviedo. Nowadays, the Sudarium is considered to be the most important relic held in Spain. Some specialists believe that it may one day assist in confirming the authenticity of the famous Shroud of Turin, perhaps even reveal hereto unknown details about Jesus Christ himself.
The Oviedo cloth is a very interesting object, but is very different from the shroud. For example, on the Oviedo cloth at that very little dimension with respect to the shroud is more than 4 meters for more than 1 meter. On the Oviedo cloth, there is a lot of blood, but there is no image at all.
The two relics, the Sudarium and the Shroud, may one day help us to better understand who Christ really was. Historically speaking, Jesus of Nazareth is an enigma. From the outset, Roman authorities had no official records relating to Jesus. But that's not surprising, given the political situation at the time.
You have to remember that Rome was the capital of the world, kind of like the United States is today. Culture came from the Roman Empire, wealth came from the Roman Empire, and intelligentsia came from the Roman Empire. Not only Rome, but the entire Roman Empire. And the Romans were never happy about the fact that Palestine, or Judea, was resisting them. So for obscure economic reasons, the Romans looked further and said, Judea better obey us, or we will strike it to the ground.
Roman-occupied Judea was looked upon as a remote province of no importance. very few administrative documents from these remote areas have survived to our times. We also need to recall that the whole Jesus affair was more of a religious issue, with the Sanhedrin opposed to Jesus, than a Roman legal matter.
I think it would be best to look at Jesus' story, the phenomenon of his life, with some modesty. So he came from Galilee with his disciples. Who were they? How many of them were there? Clearly, the Gospels say that there were 12, but that should be verified, except that it can't be verified. So he arrives with friends and with other people who were fascinated by what he'd been saying and doing, people who wanted to follow him, listen to him. It says so right in the Bible. He is going to Jerusalem with us to establish political power. We're going to be ministers. These people had political ambition. They had no idea at that point how badly things were going to turn out. So here they were, arriving in Jerusalem, some of them ambitious, and some of them mystics.
That being said, apart from the Gospels, there are other lay sources that confirm the historic existence of a man named Jesus.
Other than the Gospels, there were very few accounts describing the story of Jesus' life. There is a famous eyewitness account by aristocratic historian Flavius Josephus in Antiquities of the Jews. He spoke twice of a man named Jesus. He mentioned Jesus' connection with James, who was put to death by high priest Ananus. He spoke of James, the brother of Jesus. Another time, he gave a wonderful account where he described Jesus as a wise man who performed miracles, gave teachings, and was well liked by those around him. He went on to say that those who loved Jesus before he died continued to love him after his death. Flavius Josephus wrote, and the tribe of the Christians, so called after him, has still to this day not disappeared.
Historians from the late 19th century claimed that the authenticity of texts written by Flavius Josephus was doubtful. They were joined by Christians who wanted to drive the point home in the history books. Even here, in the church, you have highly intelligent people who will defend the historical accuracy of the paragraph written about Jesus by Josephus. Personally, I don't think it's necessary.
Another important document was a letter written around the year 112. The author was a Roman politician named Pliny the Younger. He wrote about the activities of a religious sect whose members swore an oath to never steal, lie, or commit adultery.
Around 110 to 112, there was a governor named Pliny the Younger. And he wrote to Emperor Trajan, describing the process he was using to deal with Christians. Another account appears in the Annals by Tacitus, where he talks about Rome burning under Nero. He reported that Nero blamed the fire on those people who were abhorred for their crimes and commonly called Christians, and describes the punishment they received. This was all very interesting because he mentioned that the agitators were followers of Christus, who was put to death as a criminal by the procurator Pontius Pilate. So for Roman authors, there was never any doubt that Jesus existed.
In their lifetimes, the authors of these texts, Flavius Josephus, Pliny the Younger, and Tacitus, all had the chance to meet people who had personally known Jesus, or at the very least, the sons or daughters of these people. As far as historians are concerned, the proof that Jesus existed does not lie in these documents, but rather in history itself. After Jesus was crucified, all of Palestine was thrown into an upheaval by the rapid spread of Christianity. Experts believe that this situation could not have arose had there not been real historical events triggering it, and those events were the ministry and crucifixion of Jesus Christ.
In the first century, news of Jesus' life and death spread like wildfire. In fact, it spread so quickly that it is hard to claim that it had no basis. There was certainly a real Jesus somewhere in the mix.
Clearly, the Gospels describe Jesus' ministry, but when exactly were they written? and by whom? Does the New Testament have any historic value, or is it simply the tale of a religious myth?
A gospel is not a chronicle where someone would follow Jesus, taking notes along the way as Jesus spoke, and then eventually, when Jesus died, the person would write his memoirs based on his notes. No, it wasn't like that at all. And you have to be very careful. A gospel doesn't have a lot of historical fact in it. It's not meant to be historical. It's theological. So when people say that they're historical, well, they're a bit confused. They weren't historical at all. They were theological, which means that they were meant to say something worthwhile, to teach something. They were trying to get a message across to people. Bible schools have been around for about a century. They like to study the different layers that might be hidden in the Gospels, like the layers of a cake, strawberries, whipped cream, ladyfingers, etc. So someone may say that they believe the Gospels, and they may be true. Theories may change over time, but the basic theory is that communities were expressing their faith as they wrote the Scriptures. They picked particular sermons, memories, and prayers that they wanted to preserve, and together, these added up to a story of the events at the end of Jesus' life, along with a spiritual message for his followers. But it wasn't an account of historical facts.
That being said, no one doubts that the scriptures were based on factual events, many of which have been confirmed by recent archaeological discoveries, such as the tomb of Caiaphas, high priest of the Sanhedrin, who organized the plot against Jesus. Each gospel was supposedly written by a single author: Luke, Matthew, Mark, and John. However, historians think that they may actually be a collection of a number of small stories written by several different anonymous authors and put together during the latter half of the 1st century.
The meaning and ultimate purpose of the Gospels are not fully understood. A Gospel is not a cold storage room where words are frozen for all time. It's alive. There are different Gospels, 4 as far as today's church is concerned. But there are actually many other Gospels as well, like the Gospel of Judas, for instance, which talks about him. There's also the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of James, just to name a few. Over the centuries, the church rejected these Gospels for some reason, but if you take the Gospel of Thomas, for example, you find out that Jesus took a long journey to India. So that's the goal of a biblical text, the purpose of the Gospels. And people, Christians, have always wanted to bring the written word to life.
The Gospel of Mark is now considered to be the oldest written. It is traditionally attributed to Mark or John Mark, who was a friend and confidant of Simon Peter.
From the start, there were teachings, collections of parables, and miracles performed by Jesus. Gospel writers had to put all of these elements together, and Mark was the first one to do it.
The Gospel of Mark was written between 66 and 70 AD during the First Jewish-Roman War.
Matthew and Luke based their Gospels on the book of Mark. They were inspired by almost all of the Gospel of Mark, plus one other source, sometimes referred to as the Q document, which Mark also knew about. So these writers formulated biblical doctrine that was inspired by existing traditions. They did not create all of it from scratch.
The Gospel according to John, considered to be the most enigmatic of the 4, has been attributed to the Apostle John, and historians believe this origin to be likely. From this perspective, it would be the only Gospel to have been written by a disciple who knew Jesus firsthand. These 4 books make up the Synoptic Gospels, a group of coherent scriptures officially recognized and accepted by the Church. They were adopted in their current form in the year 367, but they aren't the only text that describe the life of Jesus.
Parallel to the church-approved canonical texts were a series of Gospels known as the New Testament Apocrypha, which included the Acts of Pilate and Acts of Paul. we need to exercise caution. These texts are now often perceived as being mysterious. It's true, Apocrypha means hidden writings, but that is simply in opposition to the writings retained by the Church in the holy canon of scriptures. They were not documents that were accessed by initiates only. They were texts that began to take form in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries, reflecting popular religious belief.
Although these writings are controversial, they have not been completely rejected by the Church. On the contrary, the Vatican recognizes the authenticity of several of them. In general, if we examine the Gospels and other lay documents, what exactly do we know about Jesus? Not much in definite terms. Given the lack of description of Jesus' physical traits, many Christians in the late antiquity and early Middle Ages turned to religious relics in search of an image of Christ. In some cases, they found an answer to their question. According to certain literature, at least 2 relics bearing the image of Christ's face have survived to modern day. The most famous of these is the Shroud of Turin in Italy.
The Shroud of Turin is a linen cloth that is 4.36 meters long by 1.10 meters wide. Since 1578, it has been preserved in the Cathedral of the city of Turin itself. According to tradition, it was the burial shroud used by Jesus of Nazareth. On the surface of the shroud is an image in negative form of a man with long hair and a beard, who was tortured in exactly the same way as Jesus Christ, as described in the Gospels.
The other relic bearing the image of Christ is much more mysterious and unknown. The relic is known as the Veil of Veronica, or simply the Veronica. According to Christian tradition, Jesus fell 3 times as he walked along the path to Golgotha. After his first fall, a woman named Bernice used her veil to wipe his face, which was covered in blood and sweat. The result was that Christ's face was miraculously imprinted on the cloth. It should have been named the Bernice and not the Veronica.
The face of Veronica, venerated in Rome, of course, is a painting. What we know about this is that is a painting, but this painting is very similar to the face of the man of the shroud, because it is possible an overlay of the 2 images, and like the ancient icon of Sinai or other ancient images of Christ, there are many points of congruence between the 2 images.
Actually, the name Veronica was introduced over time. It is derived from the word vera icon, which means true image.
We have the description by Monsignor Deval more than 100 years ago, who was able to inspect the veil of Veronica closely and reported that only some dark spots were still visible. This was confirmed by Monsignor Hoberg, who I heard myself in a lecture about 30 years ago, that nothing more remained than a faded cloth and some spots. This does not rule out that the image was in a much better condition in the past, as we can see in many reproductions. But it was always dark, what is nothing unusual, since we find this darkness in many old icons, according to the taste of the time.
Up until the 6th century, the history of the Veil of Veronica remained a mystery. Some accounts placed it in Rome or in Palestine. The journey of the holy image is difficult to follow.
The first written source which mentions the Veronica is from a monk of the 11th century, which states that Pope John VII, a Greek, in about 705 ordered the construction of an oratory, a chapel in St. Peter's Basilica, named after the Veronica. In this chapel, the veil of Veronica remained as long as the old Basilica of St. Peter was used, until the new one was built and the holy image was transferred into one of the 4 main pillars of the great cupola, the so-called Veronica pillar.
Bis dann die neue gebaut wurde und das Gnadenbild schließlich jetzt in einem Pfeiler.
In 1608, the old Basilica of St. Peter was demolished and a new basilica was built in its place. The inventory of relics drawn up for the occasion included mention of the Veronica. The record book described it as a veil bearing the image of Christ's face.
For the pilgrims, the veil of Veronica was the main attraction. It even became the symbol of every pilgrimage to Rome. The tomb of St. Peter was not visible at that time. It was not accessible. But they could see something which was even more important than Peter, the face of Christ on the veil of Veronica. The veil became the symbol of every pilgrimage, and everyone who traveled to Rome bought as a souvenir a pilgrim's token with the representation of the veil and fixed it on his stick or head, so he could say that he saw the true likeness, the holy face of Christ, which others could only see in heaven.
Hat das Antlitz Christi schon auf Erden sehen können, was alle anderen ja erst im Himmel können.
We know that during the 17th century, when the Basilica of St. Peter was being rebuilt, several copies of the Veronica were produced. It is claimed that the original is now being preserved in a secret hiding place inside the Pillar of St. Veronica, one of the 4 pillars supporting the basilica's dome. Unlike the Veil of Veronica, the Sudarium of Oviedo has been studied extensively. The Sudarium of Oviedo is made from a very old fabric, giving it an appearance that is similar to that of other cloths dating back to antiquity.
The Sudarium has 60 blood stains that form a symmetrical pattern. In all likelihood, the pattern was created by folding the Sudarium, just like school children create patterns by folding ink blots on sheets of paper.
Apparently, the Sudarium was folded in two when it was placed over a man's face.
We figured out how it had been folded. You can see for yourself in the book. We think that it was likely placed over Jesus' face 3 times. The first time was probably before he was even taken down from the cross, because, according to Jewish tradition, a person's face had to be covered whenever it was bloody or disfigured. So this was likely one of the first acts of respect shown toward Jesus. Sabbath was just about to begin at 7:03. There's no mistake. We know the date. We know the time the sun set that day. Sabbath began a half an hour after sunset when the 3 largest stars appeared in the sky. And the temple sounded the trumpets to announce its arrival. It is now Sabbath. So they were rushed. He died around 3 in the afternoon. The Sudarium was placed over his face at around 4. Then there was the time it took to go buy the shroud and take the body to the tomb, so it must have been around 7 p.m. by then. That means the Sudarium was on his head long enough for it to be soaked with his bloodstains. There were even stains from the crown of thorns, but remember, I told you that Jesus was suffering from pulmonary distress, and he had an incredible amount of pulmonary fluid building in his lungs, preventing him from breathing. When he died, the fluid oozed out of his mouth. Well, both his mouth and nose, actually, since his tongue would have been quite swollen and would have been a bit of an obstruction. What's extraordinary is that it's clear that they tried 3 times to stop the blood dripping from his nose. There must have been an awful lot of blood coming out of his nose, because normally, when you pinch the nostrils, the blood stops flowing. When a person has a nosebleed, once the tendrils inside the nostrils get exposed to air, they tend to dry fairly quickly, leaving a mark on the fabric used to stop the flow. The Sudarium has 3 separate marks, showing that his nose bled 3 times, and each time, an effort was made to stop the bleeding.
When a crucified person begins to suffocate, the executioners know that pulmonary fluid is pouring into the lungs.
The cloth has traces of blood from the crown of thorns and is full of other bloodstains. Every time the body was moved, new stains were formed on the cloth. It has different rounds of blood stains superimposed on each other, each having a certain amount of time to dry before the next round. We know that it was 1 part blood and 6 parts edematous pulmonary fluid from the lungs. Obviously, there's nothing but stains on it, and it has always been recognized as the Sudarium of Christ, which had been placed on his head. What's extraordinary is that with very complicated systems, I could show you how it works using books. With a crystal head and inner conduits corresponding to the blood circulation system, I could show you how the blood would have flowed depending on the position of the head. Some of the blood had to have flowed even before Jesus died, so he must have been taken down from the cross as soon as he died. And then there's blood that flowed post-mortem, after his death. Upon analysis, the characteristics of these blood flows are not the same.
As for the traits of the blood itself, a researcher at the Madrid School of Medicine has established with certainty that the blood on the Sudarium is of type AB, which is the same as the blood samples taken from the Shroud of Turin.
Other scientific analyses of this object were carried out more recently. The blood type was determined. It is type AB. And I think it is worthwhile mentioning that this is the same blood type that was found on the Shroud of Turin and on another religious relic that can be found near Paris, in Argenteuil, the famous Holy Tunic.
Another study, this time examining the shape of the stains and their position on the cloth, revealed Semite traits in the man whose face came into contact with the Sudarium. Because of this, researchers tried overlaying the stains on the Sudarium with those on the face of the man in the Shroud of Turin.
And it has been studied, especially in these last decades, and the studies are going on. And in particular, a group of scientists also of the University of Torino, of which I belong, are studying in order to try to use modern computer techniques, in particular geometric characteristics of the trace of blood present on the shroud and of the trace of blood present on the Oviedo cloth, in order to try to understand if they are comparable. It's a very complicated work, also because it must take into account of a dynamical movement between one and the other.
The result was surprising.
The stains enabled researchers to define the morphology of the face. The size of the head and the morphology matched those of the man's head on the Shroud of Turin. They repositioned the cloth, overlaying it on the shroud, and realized that the stains on the Sudarium were very closely matched to the stains on the Shroud of Turin. So scientifically speaking, we can state without a doubt that this cloth was placed on the head of the same body that was wrapped in the Shroud of Turin.
Not only do the stains on the Sudarium and those on the Shroud of Turin line up perfectly, but the traits of the man on the shroud correspond perfectly with the lines traced by the stains on the Sudarium. It is fairly certain that the Sudarium of Oviedo and the Shroud of Turin were both used to cover the same man. Researchers were also given permission to take dust and pollen samples from the surface of the Sudarium. Among the plant residues, many were identified as coming from trees that were indigenous to Palestine: Quercus, Pistachia palestina, and Tamarix.
The first match began well before in another study by Max Frey, who analyzed the pollens in the shroud. He analyzed the pollens in the Sudarium of Oviedo and found that the pollens corresponded exactly to the historic journey of the Sudarium through North Africa. And he found two pollens that were typical of Palestine on the surface of the Shroud of Turin. There are halophyte pollens and xerophile pollens, which means pollens from salt plants that only grow in the Jordan Valley or on the banks of the Dead Sea. They were plants that grow in saline desert soils, plants that don't grow anywhere else in the world. They were found on the Shroud of Turin, which proves that it originated from the Middle East like the fabric that it was made from. The same pollens can be found on the Sudarium of Oviedo. So there was a converging of the past of the two relics. Obviously, the weave of the Sudarium is very old and is exactly the same as the Shroud of Turin.
How can these extraordinary similarities between the Shroud of Turin and the Sudarium of Oviedo be explained? What explanation can there possibly be for the amazing number of ways in which the two relics match? How could this be put down to chance if one or both of the relics were not authentic? As soon as the results were known, critics questioned the carbon-14 tests.
There was cause to ask questions, and a lot of questions were indeed asked. Scientists found themselves opposed by the attitude of laboratories, which were unprofessional in their reactions. The director of the Oxford laboratory received £1 million as thanks for showing that the shroud was a fake. Some things were quite surprising, like the failure to communicate measurements. The statistical tests used to verify whether the analysis were performed correctly were not the tests that are usually performed. The tests were abandoned since they were not correct. And then the test parameters were changed. At the Symposium of Paris in 1989, an attempt was made to clarify the situation, to understand what had happened with the carbon dating test. That was when people got really upset because it was announced that the tests were conducted blindly. They would take a sample, place it in a test tube, assign it a number. There was no explanation as to what the number corresponded to, and date it blindly. And in the hallway in the vestry of Turin, all you would hear is, number 1 is a sample from Nubia, number 2 is a sample from this or that, number 3 is a sample of the Shroud of Turin. So the analysis was not done blindly after all, and people said, hey, you lied to us. Why did you lie to us? Look, we never did the analysis blindly. We just said that to give our test more credibility with the public. And that's the truth. Why didn't they perform blind analysis? Because an archaeological item could have been preserved in a humid atmosphere or in the ground, and it may have come into contact with pollutants, especially a cloth. So it was necessary to remove the pollutants because they could falsify the dates. There would also be microorganisms like fungus and yeast that would attach themselves to the fabric, making it seem younger than it was. So there were a lot of strange things involved, which would make it possible for doubts to arise concerning these analyses.
The presence of blood on some of the relics of the Passion of Christ, such as the Sudarium of Oviedo or the Shroud of Turin, has led several authors to speculate on the idea of cloning Jesus Christ. Can we really bring Jesus of Nazareth back to life using fragmented blood samples? If it really is his blood naturally. The prospect is both mind-boggling and disturbing. Imagine for a moment, if you will, what it would be like if we could produce a genuine carbon copy of Jesus, identical in every way, physically and mentally. What would he think of us? There's a good chance that he would be disappointed. Disappointed by a world that is constantly at war with itself, where people are still ready to blow up the planet over a few barrels of oil or the control of a block of land. Disappointed by the unfair distribution of wealth in the world, and especially disappointed by societies that are more concerned with the price of gas at the pump than the tens of thousands of children dying of malnutrition every day.
I think it opens our mind to say we don't know everything. We've to learn a lot more, and we should take our cues about life, how important it is to learn to love, even in suffering, personal suffering, in rejection, the value of silence. The man of the shroud is a silent man, at peace. The value of being able to stop and take in reality and responsibility. Responsibility for my brother and sister. To do that through the medium of suffering, like many people do. The greatest people are those who serve others despite their own suffering. The greatest love stories are the ones who had to suffer a lot to accomplish their love dream.
Is there some way for us to clone the thoughts of the Son of God after we have already crucified him? It appears that 2,000 years has not been long enough for us to understand his message of love and compassion.